Chapter 5, Part 1. Even when the earthquake ended, dust continued to billow from collapsing buildings and portions of the city wall. The screaming subsided and people moved around in shock, climbing over the debris fields as they called for loved ones. Many were trapped inside the buildings. Every few hours, the earth trembled again, with less violence than before, but with each aftershock, the people's fear rose. Some panicked and fled to the city, leaving the helpless to cry pitifully for help. Others worked frantically to uncover family members. Many died, crushed between their ashlar homes. Amos stayed to help. There's another over here. He lifted stone carefully so that he wouldn't cause others to fall inward on the moaning person beneath the pile. Amos, a small groan came from beneath the rubble, a bloody hand extended. Amos worked quickly, carefully, and uncovered Ishakar. Amos, he grasped Amos' hands tightly. His mouth moved, but no words came. His eyes pleaded and he coughed. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. His hand gripped tighter, his eyes filled with fear. He choked. Amos stayed with him until his struggle ended. Then he rose to help others. Here, there's another here. People scrambled over fallen stones. Some came to help. Others used the confusion to steal whatever they could grab. Stop, thief! Stop him! He's stealing from my shop! A young man raced down the street, leaping over rubble as a goldsmith cried for help. Amos ignored the thief as he lifted another stone. A naked prostitute stared up at him with dead eyes. The man who had shared her bed had been crushed beneath a wall. Help me, a weak voice came from farther back inside the tumbled structure. A hand protruded from a narrow hole, fingers moving as though to seek the light. Help me, please, a woman's broken voice. Amos took her hand. I'm here. Her fingers tightened as she sobbed. After removing several stones and fallen timbers, he reached her. He grabbed a Babylonian drapery to cover her. She cried out in pain as he lifted her and carried her over the rubble. Placing her gently on the stones of the courtyard, he left her among the wounded. A priest appeared at the top of the temple steps, his vestments dust-covered. He scrambled over the fallen stones and made his way down the steps. When he reached the bottom, he looked at Amos, face ashen. Did you do this to us, prophet? Am I God that I can make the world tremble? The horns of the altar are broken, and the golden calf, Amos felt exultant. What? You mean it couldn't run away and save itself? Blasphemy! Look around you, priest. Look and be warned. If you set up that golden calf again, worse will befall the people, and you will be the goat that leads them to the slaughter. Another aftershock rattled the doors of the temple, and the priest's eyes went wide with fear. Dodging falling stones, he stumbled away, joining another holy man who had managed to run from the temple with the first wave of terrified worshippers and now sat bereft and confused. Watching Amos, they leaned close and talked. Amaziah came out of the temple, clearly shaken. He stared at Amos. Come and help your people, Amos shouted, but the old man ducked inside again. Night began to fall. Dozens of people still needed help. Amos worked through the night, resting when he could not go on. When he could do no more, he made his way to the city gate and stood open and damaged. Guards shouted orders. Heave! Again! Heave! Rock tumbled. Bodies had been laid out in a line against the walls, awaiting burial. This is not the vision I saw, Lord. This was not devastation. This was only a sound shaking, a warning to listen. He overheard two merchants. Jerusalem is worse off than we are. Jerusalem, horrified. Amos ran to the road. Had Bani and Ahayim survived? What of their wives and children? Stumbling, he stopped to pull the hem of his long robe up between his knees and tuck it securely into his belt. His fear had overtaken his reason. He could not run all the way to Jerusalem. Setting off again at the brisk walls, he tried to restrain his panic. Nearly 3 hours later, he reached the top of the hill of Ahil and leaned onto his staff to catch his breath, seeing Jerusalem in the distance. Solomon's temple caught the sunlight and shone bright white and gold. Amos gave a cry of relief. Tents dotted the hillsides, sheltering the hundreds who had left the city until the aftershock subsided. Everywhere was a din of human voices as people searched for friends and family members. Donkeys brayed, camels bellowed, Merchants lined the road to Jerusalem with their booths, tents of the finest goat skin, water jugs, oil lamps, blankets. Supplies had been brought from other towns and were being dispensed by soldiers keeping order. The sheep gate stood open and still intact. Amos pressed his way through the throng and headed toward the Temple Mount. If he didn't find Bani and Ahiam near their stalls, he would go to their homes. He spotted his brothers repairing a pen while young boys kept a nervous sheep contained. Bani, Ahiam! He ran and embraced each of them. You're alive! He drew back and looked them over. You're not hurt? You're shaking, little brother. Bani took Amos by the arm and made him sit. Dipping a gourd cup in a barrel of water, he held it out. I came as soon as I heard. Amos drank deeply. Bethel was struck also. The damage is horrendous. He wiped droplets of water from his beard. Ahiam looked up at the temple. God did this because King Uzziah sinned. Amos raised his head. Sinned? How? 3 days ago, he went into the temple with a censer in his hand and lit the incense. It was a great sin indeed to usurp the privileges ordained by God to the priesthood. Had Uzziah attempted to take over the temple and do the things his own way, just as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, had done? Bani handed Amos another cup of water. The priests were in an uproar trying to stop him. Ahiam pointed, I was over there when the king came up the hill. I knew something had happened, so I followed the entourage inside. Several of the priests met the king and argued with him. I heard the uproar from here. It sounded like a riot. I went running to see what was going on. Even the high priest couldn't dissuade Uzziah, Ahiam said. The king intended to make a fragrant offering to the Lord, and no one was going to stop him. The minute he lit it, let me tell him, Ahiam gave Bani a shove. I was there, not you, so tell him. Amos grew impatient. One of you tell me, it matters not which. Ahiam waved his hand. The moment King Uzziah lit the incense, he was covered with leprosy. I've never heard a man scream like that. The judgment of the Lord was upon him, and he knew it. The priests rushed him out of the temple. And then the earthquake started. Only minor damage to the temple, Ahiam said, though I thought it would come down on our heads. Some areas of the city were hit hard. Hundreds are homeless. Your homes? Both need repair, but at least we still have roofs over our head, and our wives and children are safe. Where's King Uzziah now? No one knows for sure. In seclusion, somewhere outside the city, safe and guarded. His son, Jotham, brought guilt offerings yesterday and today, and the priests have been in constant prayer since it happened. Ahiam straightened and went back to work fitting rails together. Our situation has changed over the past few days. Somewhat rested, Amos stood and gave him a hand. How do you mean? Bani answered, Heled was killed, squashed like a bug under a fallen building. He gave a short, worthless laugh at the money changer's office. Amos saw that fear of the Lord had taken root in Ahiam's eyes. For Amos, it was a spark of hope in a sea of darkness. Let it grow, Lord. Let it flourish into awe and worship, so that my brothers might not sin against you again. God sees what men do. He knows their hearts. So you have said, perhaps you should tell me again what you saw. I failed to listen the last time you were here. Amos did tell him. All day they talked. And when he went to Benai's house, the family gathered. They listened, quiet and intent, grim-faced and with a fear that went deeper than what had been aroused by the earthquake. Amos awakened in the pre-dawn hours. The clay lamp cast a soft glow. Ahiam sat silent, staring at him. Sitting up slowly, Amos looked back at him and frowned. What's wrong? Stay here, Amos said. Stay in Jerusalem. Speak to our people about what the Lord has told you. Amos shook his head. God had already sent a prophet to Jerusalem. Listen to Isaiah. I must go where God has called me to go. Ahiam lowered his eyes. If all you say is true, if? Ahiam lifted his head. A prophet is seldom recognized by his own family, Amos. You know how I've doubted you, he grimaced, because you're my brother, my younger brother. I've known you since you were a baby. You've always been a hothead, always opinionated. And now you, he struggled for words, You speak with authority. I believe you, Amos, but God help my unbelief. Nothing I've said has been said before, has not been said by God himself. He made it known to us from the beginning. We've simply forgotten. Amos shook his head. No, not forgotten. We rejected his word. He told us of the blessings he would pour upon us if we followed him. He also warned us of the cursings if we turned our backs on him. It's all there in the scriptures. Barry had read them aloud to him, though the priests may speak little of it these days. Even where there was obedience, Amos, there was hardship. Of course, life is hard. Knowing God makes a vast difference in how we live. Don't you long to see that cloud overhead again? The pillar of fire that kept darkness back? How Amos longed for those days when there was physical evidence of God's presence. But even then, men refused to believe. When I've heard God's voice speak to me, I have felt alive, Ahiam. Even when I've not even when I've not rejoiced at the message I rejoice that he still speaks to men, even simple shepherds like me. If you ask God, he would listen. Would he listen to your prayer? Would he let you stay here among your brethren? I did ask Ahiam. I spent months out in the pasture land arguing and pleading with the Lord to take this burden from me. He shook his head. I must go back to Israel. But you've told them what will come. You've done what God sent you to do. They've yet to hear. You told them. If they refuse to listen, then their blood is on their own heads. I've heard about the way you were treated. They welcomed the judgments upon the nations around them. They even rejoiced when they heard Judah would be overrun by enemies. Has anything changed? Amos shrugged. He had been popular for a while. He had drawn crowds until he told them what the Lord said about Israel. The priests had always watched him with jaundiced eyes, coveting the crowds who gathered to hear him speak. As long as the prophecies focused on the sins of surrounding nations, they could say little against him without the people wondering why. But as soon as the Lord focused his judgment upon Israel, all restraints were removed. It had been easy to drive the frightened, angry flock back into the stall of the golden calf and serve them up to idol worship. They didn't listen, did they? Ahiam challenged. Not any more than I did. No, they didn't. Perhaps the earthquake will open their eyes and ears as it has yours. Now is the time to speak, now, before it's too late. For how long, Amos? How long does it take to decide to turn back from destruction, Ahiam? One word from the Lord may be enough now to make them repent and trust God again. One decision isn't enough, Amos. Don't you understand? They will hear you for a day, a week, maybe a month or two, but they must decide each day what they will do, each and every day from now on. What hope can they find in the protection of the golden idols and pagan worship? It's all smoke, Ahiam, sweet-smelling and deadly. They may not find truth, Amos, but they find pleasure. God has allotted 70 years to men, maybe more, maybe less. That's not long on this earth. And you said yourself, life is difficult. They have shaken off the burden of the law. They won't easily shoulder it again. He rose. They will turn on you, Amos. They will tear you into pieces like a pack of wolves. Yes, or they may repent. Israel, Judah, we share the same blood. I believe you now, Amos, and yet I don't believe you. I want to believe God is the one who rules, but 45 years in the shadow of the temple has shown me how men work. Men like Heled. Heled is dead. You're free. Free of him. Free to wonder who will try to enslave me now. Ahiam looked away, the muscle working in his jaw. I can only hope to align myself with priests who fear the Lord. He turned back to Amos, as you did, brother, as you taught Ithiah and Elkanah. But there are precious few you can trust these days. More today than yesterday. The earthquake should shake men's souls. Perhaps, Ahiam gave him a tight smile. Time will tell, won't it? Amos put on his outer robe. I must go. Ahiam grasped his arm. Don't. Stay here. Tears filled his eyes. Help us rebuild. A surge of emotion swept through Amos. If he stayed, he would be disobeying God. The priests of Israel would not easily release their hold on the lost sheep they had rustled from God and now held captive with lies. Amos's eyes grew hot and moist, for he knew Ahiam did not understand the spiritual battle that raged inside Amos. He missed his family. He loved Judah, but Amos felt the stirring within his soul, the call to go back to Bethel. If he didn't, the safest place I can be is in the will of God, Ahiam. They will kill you. I can't think about that. I must speak when I'm compelled to do so. The word burns in my soul like a consuming fire. God cared passionately about his people. God fathered and mothered mankind, and yet his children wandered in the way in the wilderness. I must call out to them, Ahiam. God had sent him to call Israel home to him, to warn them of punishment if they refused. For to keep going the way they were meant eternal death and separation from God for all time. Amos took up his belt, wound it around his waist, and tied it securely. Do not make me question what God calls me to do. He put on his sandals. Ahiam followed him out the door. You're my brother, Amos. We've had our differences, but I love you. An admission choked out, all the more precious. Amos embraced him tightly. Better if you love God. He took up his staff and left.